And we're back. So we just talked about, economies of scale being an important driver of cost advantage. So a firm that can take advantage of the economies of scale is going to lower its costs. So one of the kind of things that helps with economies of scales we talked about was specialization and division of labor, the ability to specialize and get the most production out of those workers. The technical input-output relationships, right? The ability to buy something very big, a large production vessel, or buy a large uh, shopping, center like Erolku or Carrefour, rather than buying 10 1,000 meter places, you buy one 10,000 meter place, right? And you get these um, economies from these kind of buying one large thing and being able to produce many out, much more valuable outputs. The ratio of the cost that the input versus the output, right? The ratio of that cost. We call that the technical input-output relationship. But there's also this notion of indivisibilities. Indivisibilities, not invisible, it's not saying we're invisible, not that. Indivisible just means cannot be divided. So indivisibilities means like that it can only be, it's like digital. It's a 1 or a 0. You can only buy it as some unit, right? So for example, a research and development to produce a new car or a new drug, you need to do it as a unit, right? So the costs of R&D for producing a new car, you can't just do it halfway, right? So a small company or a large company, whatever size company, has to be able to invest fully in that capability or resource. Or think like a national advertising campaign, right? To be able to do a national advertising campaign is very, very expensive, but it can only be bought, that campaign, that the costs only can be bought as a whole unit to go nationwide. So the costs of that investment, if you're a large enough company, you can divide the costs over the units of your sales, and you can get economies of scale out of that investment. So if I'm, a large enough company, then the unit cost that nationwide advertising campaign is lower than if I'm a small company, but I still have to make the same large investment, but I'm a small company, so the number of units that I divide the costs of that campaign across are larger, so I don't get the same economies of scale. Let's look at these indivisibilities. It's easy to say. Oh yeah, indivisibilities, they're like being pregnant, right? You're either pregnant or you're not. There's no halfway pregnant. So looking at the scale economies in advertising for the soft drinks. If you remember, we did the cola wars, and we used that as an example of this. We didn't say the word indivisibilities, but we gave the same. If you remember from there was a table that showed the costs per case, the advertising expenditures as a cost per case, and the largest companies, Coke and Pepsi, they got the lowest cost per case because they're able to spread the costs over more cases, right? So the costs of a national advertising campaign are higher for smaller brands like Schweppes, Dr. Pepper. If you look, their cost per case on the top left is much higher. Coke, because of its volume, because of its large market share and being able to sell millions of cases, their average cost per case is much lower. So this is, the advantage of being big. The cost of product development for new autos in the 1990s. These are obviously older data, but it doesn't change, that the costs are very large. So, producing a new car, the cost of product development, it means that you have to sell a lot of cars to get back that investment. And it's the same, for example, for drug companies. The research and development costs for making a new drug are huge. So in order to get back that cost, you have to be able to sell on a global scale. This is, remember, we talked about the barriers to entry, right? The capital requirements. So becoming a new car maker, one of the barriers to entry is the cost of developing a new car and being able to get the scale required, large enough to be able to sell a large enough number of units to get back that cost. It's the same for car companies, for drug companies. This is one of the reasons why pharmaceutical companies are able to get so much profit, is because one of the barriers to entry is this research and development, and being able to sell you have global distribution and sales and production. So if we look at the economies of scale, as you sell more and more and more, right, the cost per unit goes down. That's the whole idea of an economies of scale, that the larger your numbers are, the lower your unit costs are, right? So the sources of scale economies we talked about were technical input-output relationships, right? Technical I/O relationships, indivisibilities, like being pregnant, it's not divisible. You either have to invest wholly in something or you do not invest in it at all. But if you invest in it, then the more units you sell, the more you can divide those costs over the number of units and lower your individual costs, or unit costs. And then, of course, the specialization and division of labor, which adds efficiencies, right? Only the largest companies can have this, specialization, division of labor. So economies of scale drives down the long run costs, right? So in some sense, then, a plant can only have efficient operation if it meets this minimum size. So you might have to sell, let's say, 10,000 units in order to be efficient, to have some minimum efficient production size. So that's one of the drivers of cost advantage, is the economies of scale. Another advantage comes from the economies of learning. We refer to this as experience. So that, increased dexterity. Dexterity, I don't know if you know this word, it just means the ability to, it means more like coordination, or using your hands. Dexterity is like how quickly and efficiently you can move back and forth doing something. Like if you have, it refers to your hands in originally, like the word at its roots. So a magician is very dexterous. They have high dexterity. Or someone who can juggle, right? If you're juggling, you have high dexterity. But in this sense, in the business sense, in manufacturing, it means more like the ability of workers to, to just do things correctly as they're working, to go back and forth, so that the more they're learning, the more, the longer they're used to working on the jobs. Like if somebody's working for 10 years on the manufacturing plant, they know what they're doing. They're better able to do it. They've got more efficiency. So the learning there's an economy to that, right? And also the organization itself learns how to improve its ability to coordinate, for example, using assembly lines and such. And this gets to the next point as well, production techniques, right? Using mechanization and automation in production. So maybe when a company first starts, they're in the beginning stages, they're using like handmade stuff, but then they get enough scale and they start investing in machinery and, becoming mechanized. They're using their materials much more efficiently. They're increasing the precision, less waste, right? Maybe using platforms in producing, so for example, car manufacturing, instead of using a totally different frame, right? They can make different models, like instead of using different frames, different sub-assemblies, different platforms for each model, they might be able to say, well, we'll make one, 4 or 5 different models of the car that from the outside they look like they're totally different, but they're using the same platform internally, like the same basic frame, and that increases the efficiency, right? They don't have to switch over every time their machinery. They can get some economies out of that. And the same with the product design. Designing, this is actually more about the platform, designing for automation so that the product designers, one of their goals in the design is designing to make it better for manufacturer. They call it designing for manufacturer. So, designing for automation, designing to economize on materials. So one of your product design goals, again, it's not just designing the product that, is best for the consumer, makes the consumer the happiest, but also designing for minimizing costs in automation or, economizing on materials. Another driver of cost advantage is input cost. So you might have location advantages, right? So if you can get a good low-cost location or owning low-cost inputs, like, if you're just happen to be sitting on an oil well, like in the Saudi Arabia or, the Gulf states that have, low-cost inputs, like oil reserves. Or maybe through bargaining power, right? If you're large enough, right, the larger you are, the greater your bargaining power is. So you might be able to lower your input costs. And then, excuse me, using your capacity, right, in terms of the capacity utilization. We talked about, if you remember, the ability to get in and out of an industry, right? We call it barriers to entry or barriers to exit. So if it's a very high cost, excuse me, to install or to close capacity, that's going to ruin or lower your ability to gain from these cost advantages, right? So if it's a relatively lower cost to install and to close capacity, that's good. You can utilize, you can increase capacity or decrease capacity as necessary without incurring high costs. But remember also we talked about the ratio of fixed to variable costs. Do you remember that? We talked about, for example, a hotel. It's very expensive to build, it has high fixed costs, but the variable cost of, the costs that vary with respect to sales. So for each customer served, the variable cost is really low. So, if you can capitalize on that, for example, if you have low fixed costs relative to variable costs, that's better. Then you can get higher, you're not as affected by this issue of capacity utilization. If your hotel is full and there's, high demand and low supply, that's great. You get great capacity utilization. You're going to lower your costs. You'll be able to have a very good cost advantage. But if it's a very high, fixed cost, variable cost, like it's a hotel or it's an airline, and you're suffering from a downturn, like what's happening now with coronavirus, right? All these airlines are going out of business, or they're at risk. All these hotels, airlines, a whole travel industry is at risk of going out of business because of the capacity utilization issues. So capacity utilization can be a driver of cost advantage, but it's also, can be very worrying that it can negatively affect your cost.